Alien girl's leg blown off by mine. Only a human medic offered to stitch on a synthetic leg the acrid stench of A. Scorched earth and blood filled the air as Greg Wall sprinted across the chaotic battlefield. His medical pack bounced. Against his back with each stride the weight familiar after 3 years, as a combat medic's sweat beaded on his. Forehead trickling down past his stubble jaw as he followed the desperate shouts for help. Medic, we need a goddamn medic. Over here Greg's muscles burned as he pushed himself harder his combat boots, kicking up dust on the alien soil. The Galactic Coalition had warned them about the minefields, but the Kriven diplomats had insisted on taking this route to the Peace Summit. Now they were paying the price. As he crested the ridge, Greg's breath caught in his throat amid a circle of panicking Sen soldiers stood Commander Thorx, cradling a wounded diplomat in his arms, her vibrant red skin was dulled with dust, and blood, a silver hair matted against her face. One glance told Greg everything. He needed to know her right leg was gone below the knee, vaporized by the mine's blast. Stand back, Greg shouted authority, cutting through his exhaustion. Them alien soldiers, tall and imposing in their battle armor, reluctantly made space as he dropped to his knees beside the wounded diplomat. She's losing too much blood, Commander Thorx growled, his scaled face contorted with worry. Our medical pods can't handle traumatic amputations in the field. Greg's hands moved with practice precision, applying a tourniquet to stem the bleeding. The diplomat's eyes fluttered open, startling emerald irises against the red of her skin. She gasped in pain, her body trembling. I'm Greg, he said, his voice steady as he worked. I'm going to help you. What's your name? Yara, she managed through clenched teeth. Am I going to die? Human, not on my watch, Greg replied, rummaging through his pack for painkillers. But we need to get you stabilized fast. Commander Thor shook his head, mandibles clicking in agitation. Ayak is impossible. The Drari have anti-aircraft batteries all through the sector, and our ground transport was destroyed in the ambush. Greg administered the pain medication, watching as some of the tension left Yara's face, her outfit some kind of formal diplomatic attire that resembled a black bikini by human standards provided little protection against the elements. He quickly wrapped a thermal blanket around her to prevent shock. Our camp is 6 hours away on foot, another Sen officer stated flatly. She won't survive the journey. Greg glanced at his pack, mind racing through options. The standard field treatments wouldn't be enough then. His eyes fell on the synthetic limb attachment kit. Experimental tech he'd been field testing for human soldiers. It wasn't designed for alien physiology, but I can manually attach a synthetic leg to her right here. He said the words leaving his mouth before he'd fully thought them. Through the circle of alien warriors fell silent mandibles, frozen in disbelief. Impossible, Commander Thorx finally responded. Our medical technology requires sterile environments and specialized equipment for limb attachments. Greg met his gaze. Unflinchingly, human medicine got its start on battlefields alive. Worse than this one, the synthetic limb in my pack has neural interface capabilities. It's experimental, but it could save her life. And if it fails, Thorx demanded, then we're no worse off than we are now. Greg replied, already unpacking his equipment. But I won't let it fail. Un's hand, five-fingered like a human, but with retractable claws, gripped his forearm. Do it, she whispered, her eyes locked with his. Something passed between them in that moment, trust and desperation. And something else Greg couldn't quite name. Commander Thorx nodded reluctantly. Proceed, human, but know that if she is the peace talks die with her. Greg took a deep breath and steeled himself. I'll need space, clean water, and someone to assist me. He looked down at Anar, whose emerald eyes hadn't left his face. This is going to hurt, but I promise I'll get you through it. A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. Humans, she murmured. Always so confident. It's not confidence, Greg replied, as he prepared a local anesthetic. Its stubbornness now bite down on this and try not to move. As Greg began the delicate procedure, the alien soldiers formed a protective perimeter. Around them, the battlefield faded away, and all that existed was the wounded diplomat, his steady hands, and the impossible task before him. Hold her steady, Greg barked as Un's body arched. In pain too, Sen's soldiers pinned her shoulders while he carefully aligned the synthetic limb with the remains of her leg. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes as he worked the experimental Lim's sleek gunmetal gray with flexible joint mechanisms was designed for human anatomy, but Greg had made rapid modifications using components from his medical kit. The neural interface was the tricky part. Cryon nervous systems operated differently than human ones. Almost there. He murmured more to himself than to Anar or the anxious alien. Surrounding them, his fingers steady despite the pressure, connected the final neural coupling. Now, we just need to A. Low whine filled the air, rising in pitch, until it became a piercing shriek. Everyone instinctively ducked as a Drari scout ship screamed overhead, its sensors sweeping the terrain they're hunting for. Survivors Commander Thork's growled, mandibles clicking nervously. We need to move, she's not ready. Greg snapped back. The neural pathways need time to establish connections. Move her now, and she might never walk again. The Commander's alien features hardened better, crippled than dead human. Greg felt Un's hand grip his arm again, her claws digging slightly into his skin. How much longer, she asked, voice weak but determined. 30 minutes minimum, Greg replied honestly. Then we can try activating the limb. Commander Thorks conferred briefly with his officers before turning back to Greg. You have 15 minutes. Then we move with or without the leg functioning. Greg nodded grimly and returned to his work. The synthetic limb's attachment point was secure, but getting the neural interface to recognize and integrate with Un's alien nervous system was proving challenging. He adjusted settings on his diagnostic tablet, watching as the interface attempted to map her neural pathways. Tell me about your world, Anar said suddenly, her voice strained but steady. Greg glanced up momentarily. Confused. What distract me, she explained. Tell me about Earth. I've never met a human before. Today, understanding dawned on him. She was fighting to stay conscious, to focus on something besides the pain. Earth is complicated, he began, hands continuing their delicate work. We've got oceans, so vast you can't see the other side. Mountains that pierce the clouds, deserts that burn by day and freeze by night. Sounds beautiful, she murmured, wincing, as he adjusted a connection. It can also be terrifying. His fingers divinely manipulated the neural interface. We're still figuring things out as a species. That's why I joined the Galactic Coalition Medical Corp. Thought maybe I could learn something from other civilizations that might help us back home. A small smile crossed Tyra's face. And have you learned something? Greg paused, considering. I've learned that no matter how different we all look, pain is universal. So is courage. He met her eyes. You're handling this better than most human soldiers I've treated. Her emerald eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary. Perhaps I'm simply better at hiding my fear. Time's up, human commander. Thorks interrupted, looming over them. Is it ready? Greg checked his diagnostics one last time. The neural mapping was at 68%, not ideal, but it might be enough. We're going to activate it now, he announced, fingers hovering over the control pad. Yara, this will feel strange. Your brain needs to learn that this limb is part of you now. She nodded, bracing herself. Greg activated the neural interface. Un's body went rigid, her back arching as electricity coursed through the connection points. For one horrible moment, Greg thought he'd miscalculated, that her alien physiology was rejecting the human technology. Then slowly the synthetic limb twitched. Anar gasped, not in pain but in wonder. I can feel it, she whispered. It's cold, but it's there. Relief washed over Greg. Try to move the toes, he instructed with intense concentration. Anar managed to flex the articulated toes of the synthetic foot. The movement was jerky, uncoordinated, but undeniably intentional. Remarkable, Commander Thorks admitted, mandibles clicking in what Greg had learned was the Sen equivalent of grudging respect. Can she walk? Not yet. Greg cautioned, the neural pathways need time to strengthen. She'll need support. I'll carry her, the commander declared. No, Anar said firmly, struggling to sit up. The human will help me. He understands how the limb works. Commander Thorks hesitated, then nodded curtly. Very well. But we move now. The Drari will return with reinforcements. Greg packed his equipment quickly, then helped Anar to her feet, or rather to her foot, in her new synthetic limb. She leaned heavily against him, her arm around his shoulders, his arm supporting her waist. The contrast between her vibrant red skin and his suntan human complexion was striking. Ready? He asked softly. Anar took a tentative step with her good leg, then carefully shifted weight onto the synthetic one It held though she winced at the unfamiliar. Sensation, I'm ready, she replied, determination, hardening her features lead on miracle. Worker, as they began their slow journey through the alien wilderness, Greg couldn't help but notice how perfectly she fit against his side, how her silver hair caught the light of the setting sun. He told himself his racing pulse was just adrenaline from the procedure, nothing more behind them, the battlefield. Smoldered ahead lay 6 hours of treacherous terrain, enemy patrols, and the uncertain promise of safety, but for now Greg focused only on each step on the remarkable woman beside him, and on keeping his promise to get her through this alive. Darkness fell quickly on this alien world, the unfamiliar constellations emerging in a sky tinged purple at the edges. Greg adjusted his grip on Anar as they navigated the increasingly difficult terrain. Her synthetic leg warred softly with each step, the sound barely audible over the chorus of nocturnal creatures awakening around them. We need to rest, Greg finally said. Nodding Un's labored breathing. She's pushing herself too hard, Commander Thor. Sir, their surroundings, his scaled features difficult to read in the dim light. There's a ridge ahead with defensive positioning. Will stop there briefly. The small group made their way to the outcropping of rocks. Greg helped Anar sit her back against a boulder, then knelt to examine her synthetic limb. The attachment point was red and inflamed, her alien physiology reacting to the foreign object. How bad is it, she asked, watching his face carefully. Your body's fighting the implant, Greg admitted, retrieving anti-inflammatory medication from his pack. This should help reduce the reaction, but we need to monitor it closely as he administered the injection. A distant rumble echoed across the valley. The Kribben soldiers tensed hands, moving to their weapons. Drari drop ships. Commander Thorx explained, his voice low there, expanding their search grid. Greg glanced at Anar, concern etched on his features. We can't outrun them, not with her injury. Then we hide the commander decided. There's a network of caves 2 km's east. We can reach them before the search parties arrive. Anar attempted to stand, wincing as she put weight on her synthetic leg. I can make it, she insisted, though the pain in her eyes told a different story. Greg shook his head. Not like this, the neural connections are stressing your system. He turned to Commander Thorx. I need to make adjustments, or she'll lose function entirely. The commander's mandibles clicked in frustration. How long? 20 minutes minimum. We don't have 20 minutes, Thor scowled. The Drari will be on us by then. Greg stood his ground. Then you go ahead with your men, create a diversion. I'll stay with Anar, make the necessary adjustments, and follow your trail to the caves. Absolutely not, Thorx replied. The diplomat remains under sea and protection. With all due respect, Commander, Greg countered, I'm the only one who understands this technology. If something goes wrong with the leg while you're moving her, you won't know how to fix it. Un's voice cut through their argument. He's right, Thorx, the human stays with me. Her tone left no room for debate, reminding them all of her diplomatic authority. Despite her current vulnerability, after a tense moment, the commander relented. Very well, we'll lay false trails and meet you at the eastern cave entrance. He fixed Greg with a hard stare. If any harm comes to her, it won't. Greg promised. As the Sen soldiers melted into the darkness, Greg quickly set to work on Un's synthetic limb. He opened a panel on the calf section, revealing the complex circuitry within. This might feel strange, Hant, he warned, adjusting the neural interface settings. I need to dial back the sensitivity until your body adjusts. Anar nodded, watching his hands work with the fascination. Your species has such remarkable technology to create artificial limbs that integrate with living tissue. We had to, Greg replied, focused on his task. Humans have been fighting wars since before we could write. Necessity drove innovation. He glanced up at her. What about your people? The Sen seem more advanced than us in many ways. A shadow passed over Un's face. We are selective about how we apply our knowledge. Cybernetic integration is considered unnatural. Greg's hands paused momentarily. Is that why? Commander Thorx seems so disturbed by the procedure. Yes, among my people, those with artificial parts are often ostracized. She looked down at her synthetic leg. I may face significant challenges when I return home. The implications hit Greg like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on saving her life that he hadn't considered the cultural ramifications. I'm sorry, I didn't know Yara's hand found her alien fingers surprisingly warm against his skin. Don't apologize for saving my life. Greg, some traditions deserve to be challenged. Their eyes met in the darkness, and for a moment the war there. Differences, the danger surrounding them, it all faded away. Then a distant explosion shattered the silence, reminding them of their precarious situation. That would be Commander Thor's. Diversion, Greg said, returning his attention to the synthetic limb. We need to move soon. He made the final adjustments and closed the panel. How does it feel now? Anira cautiously flexed the artificial foot, less painful, more responsive. Good, let's get you up. Greg helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she tested the leg. They had barely taken 3 steps when a blinding light washed over them from above. Greg looked up to see a Draar scout ship hovering directly overhead, its searchlight pinning them in place. Run, he shouted, pulling Anar toward the tree line. They had covered less than 20 m when the ground before them erupted in a shower of dirt and stone, a warning shot from the ship's cannons. Greg skidded to a halt, shielding Anar with his body as debris rained down around them. A mechanical voice boomed from the ship. Surrender the diplomat. Greg felt Anar tense against him. They knew exactly where to find me, she whispered. This wasn't random. Before Greg could process the implications, a hatch opened on the underside of the ship. 3 Drari soldiers descended on rappelling lines, their insectoid forms encased in gleaming battle armor, weapons trained on the pair. Any ideas? Greg asked quietly, his mind racing through their limited options. Or's hand slipped to a concealed pocket in her diplomatic attire. Just one, she murmured. When I move, be ready to run. The lead Drari approached, mandibles clicking beneath its helmet. By authority of the Drari Imperial, the diplomat Anar is hereby. Un's hand emerged from her pocket, flinging something small and metallic at the Drari soldiers. Greg had just enough time to close his eyes before a blinding flash erupted, accompanied by a high-pitched WHNE that made his teeth ache. Now, Anar shouted, suddenly pulling him forward with surprising strength. They ran through the disoriented Dry, Anar moving with newfound coordination. On her synthetic leg, Greg realized with amazement that she had adapted to the prosthetic far more quickly than any human patient he treated. Diplomatic flash grenade, she explained between breaths as they sprinted toward the cave's standard issue for high-risk missions. Remind me never to piss off, eh? Diplomat, Greg gasped, glancing back to see the Drari soldiers recovering the scout ship, swinging around to pursue them. They reached the tree line just as energy bolts began tearing through the foliage around them. The dense vegetation provided some cover, but the Drari ship continued to track their heat signatures from above. The caves are just ahead. Anar said, her synthetic leg warring with the exertion. We can lose them in the her words cut off as she stumbled, the synthetic limbs suddenly locking up. Greg caught her before she fell quickly. Assessing the problem, neural overload, he diagnosed. You pushed it too hard. Energy bolts slammed into the trees around them, showering them with burning splinters. There was no time for repairs, no time for careful movement. I'm sorry about this, Greg said, then swept Anar into his arms in a single fluid motion. Despite her alien physiology, she was lighter than he expected, or perhaps adrenaline was simply making him stronger. Cradling her against his chest, Greg ran full tilt toward the cave entrance, now visible in the distance. Un's arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder as energy bolts continued to rain down around them. Almost there, he panted, legs burning with exertion. They burst from the tree line into the open ground. Before the caves completely exposed, the Drari ship loomed overhead, its weapon systems locking onto them. We're not going to make it. Anar whispered. Just then, a barrage of plasma fire erupted from the cave entrance, striking the Drari ship's propulsion system. The vessel lurched sideways, smoke pouring from its damaged engine as it struggled to maintain altitude. Commander Thorx emerged from the cave, plasma rifle in hand. Move, human, he shouted. Greg summoned his last reserves of strength and sprinted across the open ground. Energy bolts kicked up dirt at his heels as the damaged Rari ship fired wildly. With a final desperate lunge, he carried Anar into the safety of the cave entrance. As they collapsed inside, Commander Thorx and his soldiers provided covering fire, forcing the damaged Rari ship to retreat. Status report, Thorx demanded, his alien eyes Scanning Anara for new injuries, the leg malfunctioned. Greg explained, already examining the synthetic limb neural. Overload from sudden exertion, I can fix it, but I need time, the commander nodded. Curtly will secure the perimeter, these caves extend deep into the mountain. We should be safe for now, as the Sen soldiers moved deeper into the cave system. Greg helped Anar to a relatively flat rock formation that would serve as a makeshift examination table. The soft, bioluminescent fungi growing along the cave walls provided just enough light to work by. You carried me, Anar said quietly. As he opened the access panel on her synthetic leg, Greg shrugged, focusing on the circuitry. You'd have done the same for me, would I? She mused, watching his face. My people aren't known for selflessness, and especially toward other species, and yet here you are, a diplomat working for peace. His fingers deftly reset the neural interface. People are always more complex than the stereotypes about their species. Anar emerald eyes studied him with newfound interest. You're an unusual human, Greg Walls. Just doing my job, he replied, though he couldn't help the slight smile that tugged at his lips. Try moving the foot. Now she flexed the synthetic appendage, relief washing over her features as it responded smoothly. Much better, Commander. Thorx returned, his posture tense. The Jakari are setting up a perimeter around the mountain. They're bringing in ground forces. How did they find us so quickly? Greg asked, closing the access panel on Nara's leg. That's what I'd like to know, Thorx replied, his gaze shifting to Anar. This is the third time they have intercepted us with uncanny precision. Anar met his stare unflinchingly. If you're implying I'm compromised, I'm stating facts. Thorx cut in the P Summit location was classified. The route was classified, yet somehow the Drari knew exactly where to place their mines. Greg looked between them, sensing the tension. Could your communications be compromised? Impossible, Thorx insisted. Our quantum encryption is based on Drari technology we adapted. Anar finished quietly, which means they could potentially decode it. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Greg suddenly understood the gravity of their situation. This wasn't just about saving one diplomat. The entire peace process between these species was at stake. What exactly is this peace summit about? He asked. Anar hesitated, then sighed. The Drari have developed a new weapon, a planet killer. My mission was to negotiate its decommissioning, and if negotiations fail, Greg pressed, then my secondary direct is to provide the coalition with the weapons specifications and weaknesses. She replied, information I'm carrying in a neural implant that can only be accessed by authorized Kran intelligence officers. Commander Thor's man clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. Greg had learned to recognize information that would be lost if you died in the field, or that could be extracted if I were captured. Anar added grimly. Greg ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. So that's why they didn't just blast us from orbit. They want you alive, and why we cannot allow her to fall into enemy hands, Thorx stated, at any cost. The implication was clear. If capture seemed inevitable, Lunara would not be permitted to be taken alive. Greg felt a chill run down his spine at the thought. That's not going to happen, he said firmly. We're getting her to that summit. Wake up. Greg jolted awake at Commander Thor's harsh whisper. Instantly alert, he dozed off. Despite his intention to keep watch, exhaustion finally claiming him. Anar still slept beside him, her silver hair gleaming in the blue bioluminescence. What is it? Greg asked, keeping his voice low. Thor's alien features were tense, mandibles held unnaturally. Still, we need to move now. Something in the commander's tone sent alarm bells ringing in Greg's mind. He gently shook Anar awake, helping her to her feet as she blinked away. Sleep. What's happening? She asked, immediately sensing the tension. Drari forces have breached the outer cave system, Thorx explained, already moving toward a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber. They're using heat-seeking drones. We have minutes at most. Greg checked Tara's synthetic leg, ensuring the neural connections were stable. Before they began moving, the rest had done her good. She was putting weight on the limb with greater confidence. Now, as they followed Thor's deeper into the cave network, Greg noticed something odd. The other K-band soldiers were nowhere to be seen. Commander, he called softly. Where's your squad? I've sent them ahead to secure our exit route, Thorx replied, without turning. Honor's hand suddenly gripped Greg's arm, her claws digging slightly into his skin. When he glanced at her, she gave an almost imperceptible Shake of her head, her emerald eyes wide, with warning Greg's combat instincts. Kicked in something was wrong, the passage narrowed further, forcing them to proceed in single file. Thor's lead with Anar behind him and Greg. Bringing up the rear, the bioluminescent fungi grew sparer here, plunging them into increasing darkness. The exit is just ahead, Thorx announced, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. As they rounded a bend, the passage opened into another chamber smaller than the last. With a single shaft of early morning light, it penetrating from a hole in the ceiling far above, but what froze Greg's blood was the sight of two Drari soldiers waiting, their weapons trained on them. Commander Unk's voice was steady. Despite the betrayal unfolding before them, Thor stepped away, joining the Jari. I'm sorry, diplomat, but the war must end. One way or another, Greg's hand moved subtly toward the surgical laser in his medical pack. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. You sold us out. I made a choice, Thorx corrected the Drari. Planet Killer will be deployed regardless of any peace summit. Our only hope is to secure favorable terms for surrender by trading me Anar, stated flatly, by trading the information in your neural implant. Thorx clarified the Drari have agreed to spare the central Kribben worlds in exchange. One of the Drari stepped forward, its insectoid features unreadable behind its helmet visor. Diplomat Anar, you will surrender yourself for information extraction. The human is not part of our arrangement, and will be terminated. Greg tensed, calculating their odds. 2 Drari plus Thor, 3 against 2, with Anar still recovering from her injury. Not good. And you believe them? Anar asked Thorx, contempt evident in her voice. After generations of broken tree and massacred colonies, doubt flickered across Thor's alien features. I believe in survival. Then you're a foe as well as a traitor, she spat. The dreary soldier raised its weapon. Enough discussion. Surrender, or its words cut off as a plasma bolt struck it squarely in the chest, sending it crumpling to the ground. The second Drari spun, firing wildly toward the passage entrance, where the shot had originated. 3 Cryan soldiers burst into the chamber, weapons blazing. Thor's due for cover. As the firefight erupted around them, down Greg shouted, pulling Anar to the ground behind a rock formation as energy bolts crisscrossed the chamber. The second Drari fell under the concentrated fire of the Kreven soldiers, but not before taking one of them down. Thorx emerged from his cover, firing at his own troops, his mandibles clicking in rage. We need to move, Greg urged, eyeing the shaft of light above them. That opening might lead to the surface. Gunara nodded, her eyes never leaving the battle. There's a problem. I can't climb with this leg. Greg assessed the situation quickly. The remaining Sen soldiers were locked in combat, with Thor neither side gaining the advantage. The shaft was at least 20 m high, with rough walls that might provide handholds. I'll carry you, he decided again. Un's mouth curved in a small smile. Despite their dire situation, you do realize I'm not some damsel from your human fairy tales. Never crossed my fine, Greg replied, returning her smile briefly. You're much scarier. He helped her to her feet, and they used the chaos of the firefight as cover to reach the base of the shaft. Looking up, Greg could see patches of sky through the opening. Their ticket to freedom. If they could reach it, hold on to me, ho, he instructed, turning so Anara could climb onto his back. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her synthetic leg warring softly as she positioned herself. If we survive this, going to owe you quite a debt. Human, I'll send you a bill, Greg grunted, beginning the difficult climb. The rock face was slick with moisture, in places making the ascent treacherous. Greg's muscles burned with the effort of carrying both their weights, but he pushed through the pain, finding handholds and footholds in the rough stone. Below them, the firefight continued. A stray energy bolt struck the wall near them, showering them with rock fragments. Faster would be better, Anar murmured in his ear, her breath warm against his skin. Everyone's a critic, Greg gasped, pulling them higher. They were halfway up when a shout from below caught their attention. Commander Thorx had spotted their escape attempt. He aimed his weapon upward, mandibles spread wide in fury. Traitors die, he roared, firing a barrage of energy bolts that narrowly missed them. One of the loyal CB and soldiers tackled Thorx. Disrupting his aim, the 2 aliens grappled fiercely, tumbling across the chamber floor. Greg continued climbing, his hands bloody from the sharp stone, every muscle screaming in protest. Anar clung to him tightly, her face pressed against his shoulder. Almost there, he panted as they neared the opening A. Final surge of effort brought them to the edge of the shaft. Greg hoisted Anar through first, then pulled himself up. Onto the surface, they emerged into the pink light of dawn on a rocky hillside. Overlooking a vast alien forest, we made it. Anar breathed the relief in. Her voice palpable. Greg collapsed beside her chest, heaving from exertion. Not quite yet, he managed between breaths. We still need to reach the summit location. Un's hand found her alien fingers, intertwining with his human ones. Thank you, Greg, not just for saving my life, but for believing in me. The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through him. Despite their physiological differences, despite the chaos surrounding them, there was something undeniably real in the connection between them. How far to the summit location? He asked reluctantly, pulling his hand away to check her synthetic leg for damage. Approximately 30 kilometers northeast, she replied, wincing slightly as he adjusted a connection. Through the forest of whispers, Greg glanced at the dense alien woodland stretching before them. Friendly name. Any actual whispering I should be concerned about? Out. A ghost of a smile touched Untara's lips. The trees contain symbiotic organisms that communicate through ultrasonic frequencies to Cryan ears. It sounds like whispering, and to human ears, nothing at all, she assured him, though some find the forest disorienting. Greg finished his examination of her leg and helped her to her feet. Can you walk that distance? Anar tested her weight on the synthetic limb. With your adjustments, yes, though not quickly. Then we better get moving. Greg shouldered his medical pack. The Drari will figure out where we exited soon enough. The day wore on as Greg and Anar pushed deeper into the forest of whispers. The alien foliage grew denser. The membrane leaves overhead, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the forest floor. We should rest, Greg suggested, noticing Un's slight limp. Returning. Check your leg. They found a small clearing where several fallen spiral trees created a natural shelter. As Anar sat, Greg knelt on his diagnostic tool. Your neural pathways are adapting to the interface at an extraordinary rate. Perhaps our species are more compatible than either of us realized, she said, her tone carrying a meaning beyond the medical. Greg looked up, meeting her gaze. The air between them seemed to charge with unspoken possibilities. How does it feel now? He asked after making adjustments. Anar stood testing her weight on the synthetic limb. Better. Connected. She took a few steps, then turned with a smile. It's becoming part of me. They continued their journey, moving side by side through the strange forest. The silence between them had changed. Charge was something else entirely. Your people, Anar began after a while. Do they form bonds with a species? Some do. Interspecies relationships aren't common, but they happen. And you? She asked. Have you ever been drawn to someone not human? I've admired individuals from other species, he answered honestly, but I've never felt. He paused, searching for the right words. Never felt what Anara prompted this. Great, Greg admitted. Anar stopped walking, turning to face him. Fully define this. Human. Greg couldn't help but smile at her directness. This connection, this feeling that despite coming from different worlds, different biologies, there's something resonant between us. I feel it too, she said softly. It's unexpected. A distant crashing sound broke the moment. They both tensed instinctively, moving closer together. Jakari patrol, Anar whispered. Ground troops. They quickly took cover behind a massive root system. The Drari patrol came into view, 5 soldiers in full battle armor scanning the forest with handheld devices. Greg and Anar remained perfectly still as the patrol passed. Directly beneath them, one soldier paused its sensor device, emitting a series of beeps as it pointed upward. Un's hand found Greg squeezing tightly. The dreary soldier adjusted its sensor. The beeping stopped and it moved on. They carefully descended from their hiding place. As Un's feet touched the ground, she stumbled slightly. Greg caught her, his arms encircling her waist. Their faces were suddenly inches apart, her emerald eyes wide for a heartbeat. Neither moved. We should keep moving, Anar said finally. Though she made no attempt to pull away, we should. Greg agreed, equally motionless. Then, with a decisiveness that seemed to characterize everything she did, Anar closed the distance between them. Her lips met his in a kiss that was both alien and achingly familiar. Greg responded instinctively, one hand moving to cradle the back of her head. The differences in their physiologies, her warmer temperature, the slight metallic Taste of her lips only heightened the experience when they finally parted both. Slightly breathless, Un's eyes searched his face. Is this acceptable among your people? Greg couldn't help but laugh softly. Very acceptable, though usually it comes after a few formal dinners. My apologies, she replied with a hint of mischief. I've never been particularly patient with protocols. They continued their journey with renewed purpose. The path grew steeper as they approached the foothills of a mountain range visible through breaks in the canopy. The summit is being held in an ancient Sen temple, Unar explained, neutral ground protected by coalition peacekeepers. I'm wondering what happens after we arrive, Greg said. After your mission is complete. Unar glanced at him. Understanding the unspoken question, you're concerned about us, about what this means, aren't you? He countered. Gently, in my former life, as a sentinel, I was taught to focus only on the mission. Personal considerations were irrelevant, and now Greg pressed, now I find myself thinking beyond the mission, she admitted, considering possibilities I never allowed myself to contemplate before. As the day waned, the forest began to thin, giving way to rocky terrain ahead. Built into the side of a mountain stood an imposing structure of gleaming stone, the ancient temple where the peace summit awaited. We made it, Greg said, relief evident in his voice. Before he could celebrate further, Trier soldiers emerged from behind the rocks, weapons trained on them. Commander, Thor stepped out from behind them. Did you really think you could outrun us? Thorx asked, mandibles clicking in satisfaction. Greg assessed their situation grim. At least a dozen Drari soldiers surrounded them, the human stays with the diplomat. One Drari announced, our scientists are interested in the synthetic limb technology. That wasn't our arrangement. Thorx protested. The arrangement has been modified, the Drari replied dismissively. Both specimens will be studied. Unar leaned closer to Greg, whispering, when I move, be ready. She straightened, addressing Thorx directly. I wish to invoke the right of parley while Thorx argued with the Drari. Greg noticed movement at the temple entrance, coalition peacekeepers taking positions. Unar threw another flash grenade, and chaos erupted. Energy bolts sizzled through the air as coalition forces returned fire. Stay low, Unar shouted, partially shielding Greg from the firefight. We need to reach the temple, Greg called. It's our only chance. They burst from cover, running in a zigzag pattern toward the temple entrance. Coalition forces provided covering fire, forcing the Drari to seek shelter. They were halfway to the temple when an energy bolt caught Unar in the shoulder, spinning her around without hesitation. Greg scooped her into his arms, continuing their desperate dash toward safety with a final burst of speed. Greg carried Unar across the threshold, collapsing to his knees. As they reached safety, coalition forces closed ranks behind them, sealing the entrance against the dreary assault. Is the summit still proceeding? Greg asked a human officer. It was law when we lost contact with the diplomatic convoy, the officer explained, but now that the diplomat has arrived, it can begin as soon as she's able. Unar insisted on speaking with Greg privately before being taken to medical. What happens after? He asked softly. When this is over, when I've delivered my information and the summit concludes. What happens to us? The question hung between them, weighted with possibility and uncertainty. I don't know, Greg admitted. Honestly, interspecies relationships in the coalition are complicated. Everything worthwhile is complicated. Unar countered with a smile. Greg returned her smile, feeling a surge of affection for this remarkable being. Then, I guess we'll figure it out together, one step at a time. 3 months after the peace summit, Greg stood at the observation deck of the coalition medical station orbiting Kren Prime. The planet's surface gleamed below its twin oceans, reflecting the light of its star. Nervous? Asked Dr. Palmer, his supervisor, joining him at the viewport. A little, Greg admitted. It's not every day you receive a commendation from the Coalition High Council, and it's not every day a field medic helps prevent an interstellar war, she replied, with a smile in the diplomatic reception area. Unar waited for him, silver hair cascading down her formal diplomatic robes. When she turned at the sound of his entrance, Greg felt the same jolt of connection he'd experienced in the forest. You look well, he said, nodding with satisfaction that she walked without any trace of a limp. The synthetic leg moved in perfect harmony with her natural one. As do you, she replied, embracing him. Coalition formal uniforms suit you there. Hands found each other naturally as they gazed down at the planet below. "I've missed you," Greg said simply, "and I you." Anar replied, "These past months have been challenging your people's reaction to the synthetic leg," he guessed. She nodded. "Some traditionalists consider me tainted." Impura's smile touched her lips. "I found I care less about their opinions than I. Once did I've been offered a new diplomatic posting." She continued as Cryan ambassador to the coalition. Central Council on Earth. Greg's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's prestigious. I wanted to discuss it with you first," Anar said, watching his face carefully, "because my decision depends in part on whether there might be a future for us. I've been offered a position." 2. Greg admitted, chief medical liaison for interspecies relations at coalition headquarters. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. "It seems the universe is conspiring to keep us together," Anar observed with a smile. "Or maybe we're just making choices that lead us in the same direction," Greg countered, reaching up to touch her face gently. "There will be obstacles," Yara warned. "Earth's atmosphere requires me to take supplements. My diplomatic status will complicate matters, and there will always be those who disapprove. I'm a field medic," Greg reminded her with a smile. "I'm pretty good at overcoming obstacles in answer." Anar closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that felt like coming home. "Your capacity for adaptation fascinates me," she said afterward, "not just physically, like attaching synthetic limbs in battlefield conditions, but emotionally, your ability to form connections across boundaries that most species consider impassable. Maybe that's what humans bring to the galaxy," Greg replied. "Not the most advanced technology or the strongest military, but the willingness to reach across differences and find common ground." As they made their way to the ceremonial hall, Greg reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together, from a desperate battlefield procedure to a connection that transcended their differences. They had found something rare and precious amid conflict and chaos, whatever challenges awaited them on Earth, whatever obstacles their different biologies and cultures might present. They would face them together, one step at a time.